Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. My notes say I should introduce myself, but I think I'm getting to be well known for better or worse. I am Barry Mills, the Interim Chancellor, for those of you who don't know me, and I want to thank you all for joining us for what is our 7th annual Distinguished Faculty Lecture. Now, we're here today to hear presentations from 3 of our most impressive faculty members who earned the 2017 Chancellor's Award for Distinguished Scholarship, Teaching, and Service. These awards are given out at commencement each year, the last commencement, which I had the pleasure of attending, and I think, given their length, may have just ended, each year in recognition of our honorees' excellence in the classroom, their achievements in their respective fields, and their commitment to this university, its students, and our community. As a first-time attendee at this event, I'm eager to hear from all of these folks, our distinguished awardees, and to learn more about the positive impacts they have brought to the UMass Boston community over their many years of service. Many of the people in this room I know are here today because you have worked with Professor Maxim, Olchanyi, Kenneth, Rothwell, and Linda Dumas, and you probably already have a good idea of the enormous contributions that they've made to this university over the years. This afternoon, we will have the honor of listening to each of them present a topic of their own choice in accordance with our theme, Reflections from Distinguished Faculty. All 3 of these professors offer a special contribution that is critical to UMass's ability to fulfill its mission. At Boston's Public Research University, we must continue to lead in the areas of scholarship and in teaching and in service. And these professors embody all the best that we have to offer. When one thinks about being a professor in a great university like this, it is important, I think, to remember the importance of being an institutional leader in the broadest sense. And that means a commitment to your own scholarship, to teaching students, and to this institution, and thinking about leading in ways that will lead this institution into the future in important and responsible ways. And knowing these folks as sort of well as I do, I know that today we have 3 people who really represent what we should be aspiring to achieve, each and every one of us as leaders of this university. So I want to congratulate you for the work that you've done for this university, for the kind of accomplishment you've made in your scholarship, to what you do for our students, and for your institutional leadership. It means an enormous amount to this university. I'd like to also extend a special thanks to the committee members who helped distinguish these 3 faculty members from all the very worthy nominations. I imagine that is a very hard chore, trying to figure out who the 3 most impressive people to honor each year are. It is not an easy task. But the committee devotes careful judgment to these selections, and as evidenced by the people that we're going to hear from today, they do a great job. I'd also like to thank Joanne Riley and Mary Rosa from the University Libraries for the continuing work to keep this tradition alive. Keeping traditions alive is not such an easy thing to do. And so thank you for continuing to do that. Each year, it gives us an opportunity to come together and an important opportunity for us to appreciate each other, to engage with one another, and to celebrate our university, because that is in many respects what we do here today. So I want to thank you all for taking the time out of your very busy schedules to be here today. It's a pleasure to see you come out and support your friends and colleagues. And like you, I'm eager to hear what they have to say. So thank you all for being here. I look forward to hearing what you folks have to say. And now it's my opportunity to introduce our interim provost and vice chancellor for academic affairs, Emily McDermott. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure for me to be here today to both honor and learn from 3 very distinguished colleagues at the university, those who have earned the Distinguished Faculty Awards at our 2017 commencement. Now, I have a habit of doing this, and I'm going to do it again. That is to point out that a Latin dictionary definition for the word facultas, one of the Latin dictionary definitions, is power. That means basically, for all of you faculty out there, that faculty power is a tautology. But we know for sure that these three faculty have helped all other faculty at the institution to power this university towards greatness and towards achievement. What we do know for sure is that we have a university that's on the march towards excellence, greater excellence at all points. It's been excellent for many years, as I can attest, having been here for many years. But we keep moving forward, and we do it with the help of faculty like those that we will be honoring tonight. So first, Professor Olchanyi, the Distinguished Scholarship Awardee, has acquired international renown for his work in quantum mechanics, cold atomic systems, quantum gases, integrable systems, and non-equilibrium quantum phenomena. He has developed an impressive record of academic productivity during his career, with more than 50 papers published over the past 25 years, including 18 in high-impact journals, with 2 of his papers having accumulated more than 1,000 citations each. He's also been successful winning grants to support his work, with more than $1,300,000 in new grants since joining UMass Boston in 2007. He's produced many influential works, including Thermalization and Its Mechanics for Generic Isolated Quantum Systems, published in the journal Nature, and he also authored the book Back of the Envelope Quantum Mechanics. I'd like to be able to read some quantum mechanics on the back of an envelope. He's also a fellow of the American Physical Society. Professor Olchanyi's colleagues say that he is an undisputed leader in quantum gas theory and many-body physics, and his willingness to reach across departmental boundaries and to invest the time and effort needed to develop a common language with researchers from other disciplines is unusual. Professor Olchanyi.
It's in quite an unusual setting because you usually receive the screens and things. So I will assume that you're seeing the same thing I'm seeing. So kaleidoscopes. So all of you know what they are. You saw them in your childhood. I mean, they're nice toys. You look at them, and there are nice symmetric figures and colors and things. But we are going to use them in practical applications. So thus. One needs a definition, but I was looking for the definition which is the most acceptable by everyone. So I was looking for a definition that I can present in my presentations for the second graders in discovery museums in Acton. And so I found it. So kaleidoscopes are the systems of mirrors where one doesn't know where one mirror ends and another begins. So what you see here is, in fact, a kaleidoscope in the Exploratory Museum in San Francisco. It's 3 mirrors. I won't be moving away from the mic. So it's 3 mirrors at 60 degrees to each other. Some people are standing inside, and the game is to actually to know where the real object is, where the reflection is, and where one reflection ends and another reflection begins. And if you can see, so I want to show it on that thing. So if this scene between the mirrors was better, you wouldn't know where the shoulder, whether this part of the shoulder belongs to one mirror and that part of the shoulder belongs to another mirror. And those are interesting objects per se, and there's deep mathematics behind them, and the mathematics behind it, all of it I learned from Professor Stephen Jackson from mathematics, and we are collaborating ever since. And the symmetry properties of kaleidoscopes, they stem from the symmetries of Platonic solids. So now Platonic solids, so they were, some of them were identified before Plato, so basically they are three-dimensional figures where each side is very symmetric. So it's an ideal polygon, and then all vertices are indistinguishable one from another, and there are only 5 of them. So in 2 dimensions there is many. In 4 dimensions there is 6. There are higher dimensional ones which are hard to think about, but Professor Noel, also from mathematics, and he was in fact working on a computational project to tinker and to classify, to taxonomize the higher symmetries in higher dimensions. And so there is that was another guide. And so the way science operates is that we have an unusual rare object, and we're trying to actually map it to something else, and then ideally create either new effects or devices or discover new physics with them. And it turns out that you can actually translate the language of mirrors and light rays to moving particles. So in particular, one may try to replicate some effects which are obvious in terms of mirrors, but they're not obvious in terms of particles. So in particular, one can say that if one takes a Platonic solid and runs a light ray through a center of one of the sides perpendicular to the side, this ray will exit either through the center of another side or through a vertex. So this comes from how beautiful they are. I mean how symmetric they are. And if you translate it to particles, something else happens. So this is a snapshot. I won't be showing it, but this is a snapshot from Brian Greene at Stephen Colbert's show, showing the thing which is called a Galilean canon. So it's a collection of balls. In his case, it was 5. In my case, I have 4, and I have them with me. And the masses are tuned in such a way that there's a map between this system of these balls and a 4-dimensional kaleidoscope that reflects the symmetry of a 4-dimensional tetrahedron. Never mind. So what's important is that, so for a tetrahedron, so let's go one step back. We enter one interesting point, the center of the side. We exit another interesting point. For the balls, one interesting point is when 4 balls come together, they hit the 5th one, which is the Earth, and then, I mean, for a run-of-the-mill thing, I mean, they will just scatter. I mean, nothing interesting will happen. But if you have a kaleidoscopic symmetry, then what will happen is that all the heavy balls, they will transfer all their energy to the lightest one, and we'll say that that's unusual and that's impossible, but that's exactly what happens. Yeah, I have another one. I'll get it later. Yeah, thanks. Right, and now what one can imagine is that you run the sequence backwards. So instead of all 4 balls hitting the ground, instead imagine that the heavy ones stay at rest, and then the light one hits them, and then they all depart with the same velocity. So what we say in physics parlor is that you would establish a correlation between the motion of the light one and the motion of the heavy, because they will all start moving with the same velocity, which is, again, heavily unusual. And this is precisely the effect we're going to use, but first we need to quantize it. So first we actually want to build a quantum device. And what is the quantum mechanical analog of what you just saw? Well, it's easy to decide. I mean, it is in fact quantum Galilean canon. Quantization is very easy. You just add quantum to the beginning. Since I have only 15 minutes, so I have to explain the whole of quantum mechanics in 30 seconds. And actually, we do have a worldest universe galaxy expert on fundamental questions of quantum mechanics, Chris Fuchs, so from physics department. So first thing he would tell you, and he will let me know if I misrepresent his words. So Schrödinger cats you hear about from the popular literature and so on and so forth, they're heavily overrated. So they look nice. I mean, they're half dead, half alive. In reality, of course, they're half dead, half alive, according to me and according to Chris, according to what I think about what Chris thinks. They're half dead and half alive only in our imagination. So it is, the superposition is actually a betting book, is our book of chances of, oh yeah, there is a 50% chance that it's dead and 50% chance that it's alive. and then when we open the box and it's either dead or alive, so our chance book changes because we change a record in it. But in reality, nothing really happened. So the quantum mechanical superpositions are not as mysterious as we present them to be to you and to funding agencies. But the true mystery of quantum mechanics is much more interesting and much deeper. So it's only in quantum mechanics possibilities, options can, instead of adding, they can negate each other. And so in a quantum world, you can imagine that there is one lottery, playing one lottery, you have 0.002% of winning in this lottery. So then you can try another lottery. And in this lottery, there's also 0.002% of winning. And imagine I'm buying two lottery tickets, and I play both. So logically, the probability of winning should be 4,000%. But in the proper state of the system, the chances of winning will be 0. So in fact, what we're adding, if you want, what we're adding is not the probabilities, but roughly the square roots of them. And square roots can be both positive and negative. And one square root can be positive, and another square root can be negative. And you add them together, and you get 0. And this is the lottery illustration of the so-called Jung's experiment. So the first Jung experiment was done with light, with photons. But is there a movie? Yeah, so I think so. Yeah, so the first Jung experiment was done with photons, but then in 1925 it was repeated with electrons. And so what you see there is indeed this slot through which electrons pass. That's one lottery. That's another. So if you play one, you see just some cloud. If you play another, you see just some cloud. You add them together, and in some places, you don't win at all. I mean, no. So there's no. So it's as good as not buying the tickets at all. And this is something that I wanted to add this slide, and I forgot. This is something what is very relevant to what Richard Feynman said to someone who asked him about mysteries of quantum mechanics, what to do about them, and how to accept them. And his answer was, shut up and calculate. So just don't think about them. I mean, our brains are not wired to actually understand quantum mechanics, but they are wired enough to use it. I mean, so we know all the rules and recipes, and this is precisely what we're doing. So this structure, this black and white structure, the structure where you either have electrons or you don't, it turned out to be extremely useful. So in fact, so this is almost the end of my quantum mechanics in 30 seconds. So quantum mechanics says that actually each particle is at the same time a wave. So it has some wave property. So each particle has a wave associated with it. And this wave is very interesting because in fact, this wave, depending on the mass of the particle, it could be very sharp. So the distance between the peaks can be very sharp. The heavier the object, the narrower it is. And basically what we have is that along with each atom or with each molecule, there is a flying ruler. So there is a very fine ruler. And we can use this ruler. We can then start shoving these rulers in say, in the gravitational field and measure the displacements in the gravitational fields just by using the very same ruler. And that's why, in fact, so the major application of this type of science, so atomic interferometry it's called, is either in navigation, both civil and military, and in oil exploration. Because given the sufficient accuracy, we would be able to see oil cavities underneath the Earth just by the changes in the gravitational field they introduced. All that requires lots of navigation back and forth on the quantum classical interface, and actually I wouldn't be able to do it without that help from another colleague, Bala Sundaram, who knows everything about this precisely point in space. I mean, how to go back and forth and not to get entirely mad in the process. So he's truly he truly helped all of us, and there are many of us who are building quantum machines. In fact, so Adolfo Del Campo, Alyosha Hama, Kurt Jacobs. I mean, they're all thinking about either measurement applications or quantum computation applications, or the actual new thermal nanomachines that would move microscopic robots in your veins in a few years. And some of them are even building them. So Matthew Bell, in fact, in the engineering department, he is building the amplifiers for quantum computers. And now one slide about my actual project. So indeed, so it's a device which is based on the symmetry of a four-dimensional tetrahedron, which is based on the symmetry of a four-dimensional tetrahedron. So this is the Galilean canon you see, run backwards. And so the advantage is that you actually only create a Schrödinger-Cat-like superposition for a light particle, and then you use higher conservation laws, the higher symmetries of the tetrahedron to actually propagate quantumness to the heavy ones instead of inducing the quantumness directly, which is extremely hard. And to do that, we need one-dimensional waveguide cold molecules, and cold it's 1,000 millions of a Kelvin above absolute zero, and we are already there. Actually the technology is at sub-nanokelvins. All that involves all very different branches of mathematics and physics, but especially mathematics, and half of them secretly. And so I know from these publications. So in Russian it's Quant. So that's a magazine for high school students interested in math and science. And thanks to Arthur Eisencraft, it has been translated to English, and it has been published for many years, I think for more than 20 years. With amendments, and that's a great, actually, when you want to learn a new thing like topology, so don't own textbooks, secretly open that, and then you it's really the first stop for everything. I mean, it has articles about everything, and thank you, Arthur, for that. And for those of you who are still awake, you wanted to see kaleidoscopes. So here I'm giving an example of a quantum wave function for two particles of a mass ratio 1 to 3 in a box with rigid walls for different strengths of interactions between the particles. So this is for the hard cores, for hard balls, and then when you make them slightly mutually transparent, you get this. Oh, it looks nice. And then when I increase the transparency more, we get that. And these are the kaleidoscopes you came for. So in summary, we're indeed using an extremely so we're using indeed mathematics from antiquity. So indeed the properties, the geometric properties of the most ideal geometric objects in the world, and they're Platonic solids. There's nothing more ideal than that. So we suggest an actual devices. So that's this interferometer based on a Galilean canon based on a four-dimensional tetrahedron, and what you see up there, those are these fringes. And if we're lucky, I mean, so for a given range of parameters, I mean, the distance between the fringes could be in hundreds of nanometers, and that's really, that is really good for navigation. So outlook and thoughts. So science is an uninterrupted continuum, millennia notwithstanding, and so indeed, I mean, we can learn from all centuries and all millennia. UMass Boston is a great place to be, as you can see from my references. And there is something I wanted to share with you as someone who has a deep, intimate experience with three educational systems, with French, Russian, and the American. So the time came to bring the US STEM curriculum to what the rest of the world is doing. We need at the very least, double the total workload, the total course credit requirement for STEM. I mean, this is, I mean, so if you open it, if you open any curriculum in the world, this is what you're going to see, or even higher. And this is not including the PhD programs, because again, in the rest of the world, people don't study in PhD. So all the classes are lumped into the undergraduate programs. And another thing is that we have to return to mathematics as we know it, which is it's a science of proofs, because mathematics with proofs, it's like learning playing music instrument by listening to it. I mean, and this is again something that is well tested, and we shouldn't be experimenting with that. And I know it will take years, decades till we get back to being competitive in the new world, and but really needed. And I will finish with a quote from my favorite science fiction writer, Greg Egan. So mathematics catalogs everything that is not self-contradictory. Within that vast inventory, physics is an island of structures rich enough to contain their old beholders. And this is us. Numerous discussions and collaborations with late Martin Girardot, who was my mentor, Stephen Jackson, Alfred Noel from mathematics, my students, postdocs, and research professors, so Vanya Dunke, Zion Huang, Dmitry Polsky, Thibaut Skukert, Joanna Ruhl, my colleagues from the departments, Bala Sundarman and Dolph Del Campo, and my colleagues from all over the world, Felix Werner from ENS, Jean-Sébastien Coe from Amsterdam, and experimentalists, Dominique Schneble, Randy Hewlett, Hélène Perrin, Romain Dubussy, and bits and pieces of this talk have been given already to second graders in the Discovery Museum in Acton. And it has been supported by NSF, then by NSF-BSF, US, Israel by National Science Foundation. The green thing is a grant that is given to Paris area for cold atoms, and by the Office of Naval Research. And thank you very much.
So the first speaker has taken us back from rockets to Plato, and now the second one is going to take us from Plato up to Donald Trump. An interesting phenomenon. This year's Distinguished Teaching Awardee is Professor Ken Rothwell, who has more than 20 years of teaching at UMass Boston, with student success being foremost in his approach to the classroom. Given the interdisciplinary nature of the field of classics, it's not unusual for classics department faculty to teach a wide variety of courses, but Ken's count of unique courses prepared and taught at UMass Boston now stands at an impressive 41. He's taught all levels of Greek and Latin language, as well as classical studies courses in literature, religion, political thought, art history, and philosophy. His large enrollment Greek and Roman myth class draws up to 200 students per semester, students who testify enthusiastically to his ability to actively engage them throughout the whole hour of his lecture. He has, in addition, served as department chair for 15 of the last 18 years, and in which time he's developed curricula, guided new courses through governance, and helped build the department's graduate program that started in 2011. Professor Rothwell is a consistent educational innovator and adopter of new technologies, including his recent use of technology-enabled active learning classroom in University Hall for his course, Magic and Science. His students say that he has that rare gift, the ability to take challenging subjects and make them not just manageable, but enjoyable as well. Ken?
Thank you. Emily, thank you. I'd also like to put in a word of thanks to my colleagues, Peter Barrios-Leck and Jackie Carlin, who worked on the nomination for this prize. And I can't help but thank Chancellor Motley. I don't see him. I think if he were here, I'd see him. But in any event, he was the one who put that medal around my neck, and I appreciated that. In fact, I was thinking, maybe I should be wearing that thing today. I don't know what I'm ever going to do with it. If I don't wear it today, it'll just sit in a box, and my great-great-grandchildren will find it and wonder what's going on. Well, I could talk about my tips and tricks of teaching, but I decided that just isn't that interesting to me, and I don't think it would be as interesting to you, and it's certainly not very original. So instead, I want to give you a history lesson. This really comes out of my course that I teach on the history of science in ancient Greece, and it's a topic that's been very interesting to me because it also becomes a kind of history of education. When you track students and teachers over the course of one generation after another, you can see them maybe make some progress in the history of science, sometimes yes, sometimes not, but you certainly get a good feel for the interaction that teachers and students have with one another. Of course, one of the best ways to understand any culture is to compare it with another. And so I decided to choose China, partly because ancient Chinese science and teaching is reasonably well documented, but maybe even more because there's a terrific book about this by G.E.R. Lloyd, Adversaries and Authorities. G.E.R. Lloyd wrote about the history of ancient Greek science for about 30 years. 1987, he took a sabbatical from that and spent 5 years immersed in learning Chinese and learning everything he could about ancient Chinese culture and science and philosophy. And the result is absolutely fascinating. So I'm going to just jump into an example of a student-teacher exchange from ancient China. This is from a mathematical treatise, and the student says, "Although I'm not intelligent, master, I would like you to favor me with an explanation. Can someone like me be taught the Tao this way?" And the teacher says, "Yes, all these things can be attained to by mathematics. Your ability in mathematics is sufficient to understand such matters if you sincerely give reiterated thought to them." Well, you'll have to take it on my word, in Lloyd's word, that this is representative of things that go on in the teaching of science and math in ancient China. I want to make 2 points about it. One is to see how deferential the student is to the professor. He is completely dependent on the teacher. The teacher is the source of wisdom, and the student shows allegiance to this teacher. This is typical of ancient Chinese education. I understand it is also an important feature of modern Chinese education as well. Now, we like to think that this can happen in any culture, in any time, in any place, that a teacher would be given some deference from students. Okay, back to that in a minute. There's another feature of this, though, that I think is interesting. And again, you wouldn't expect this in a short quotation, perhaps, but neither teacher nor student is presenting himself as an innovator. The goal is to preserve and transmit the teachings of the master. It's imperative to preserve a kind of consensus. Rather than tear down traditions or the past, their approach is to say that they are building on the past. Now, some of this is rhetorical. There are times when a Chinese student will, in essence, overturn a scientific understanding, but he will cast it in terms of how he's going to build on what the great master has taught us, rather than overthrow it. So it's partly rhetorical, but it's an important cultural component there. Now, an exception that proves the rule is that when there are disagreements in ancient Chinese science, it's over who has the correct interpretation of the master's teaching. Now, the way we explain it is right. No, you're explaining it wrong. The master said this, not the other thing. Again, it's all in terms of what the master has done. They're trying to show their respect for authority. Greece. I'm going to transition a little bit away from the teaching of science to something else. I want to use some mythology as an example for Greek education. There was a story that when Heracles was young, his parents were trying to decide what teachers to have him study with. He was doing things like chariot racing, wrestling, archery, fencing. They got the best teachers they possibly could, but then they thought they should give a little balance to this curriculum. So they decided to have him take music lessons. And they found the best music teacher out there. This is a man named Linus, who was the brother of the great poet Orpheus. You couldn't do better. Unfortunately, things did not go well. One day, he showed up not having practice. Linus smacked him, and our sources say that he scolded him for having sluggishness of soul. Heracles, in response, broke a chair and clubbed Linus to death. Now, he was taken to court, but he must have had a very good lawyer because he was acquitted on the grounds that Linus had actually provoked the fight and that this constituted a sort of self-defense when you murder your music teacher. By the way, there's a comedy that somebody wrote about, the playwright named Alexis wrote about this. It's lost. I would love, this is one of these works of literature that I'd love to get back to find out how this was cast on the comic stage, an overbearing Heracles with a music teacher. In any event, my general point then is that in Greece, okay, it's not all right to murder your teacher, but it is expected that you would disagree with your teacher. From one generation after another, you find that students are showing that their teachers, trying to show that their teachers are wrong and that they are right. In-your-face argumentation was absolutely acceptable. In fact, the Greeks spent a lot of time thinking about how you can disprove your opponent. Maxim mentioned proofs in mathematics. The Greeks were not necessarily the best mathematicians in the ancient world, but they were the mathematicians who were very concerned about showing how you prove a theorem in mathematics. You know, okay, you make this assertion, prove it to me. They worked on rhetoric, they worked on logic, they worked on philosophy. All of this comes out of the debate-driven culture that ancient Greece was. In politics, they had a democratic assembly in Athens. They were used to arguing with one another, to talking back to their superiors. The courtroom system was predicated on watching two lawyers argue back and forth. So it's only logical to think that this would work its way into physics, astronomy, marine biology in particular, and above all, medicine. I think that's partly because that's where the money is. The stakes are higher. Look what happened with my patient when I gave him my treatment. Your patient died. And this kind of thing turns up all over the place in the treatises about ancient medicine, little carping remarks about how the people on the other side just didn't have it right. So competitiveness is, I think, a core characteristic of ancient Greece, being willing to show that someone else is wrong and that you are right. Don't forget, these are the people who invented the Olympic Games. They had it from the get-go. There's a negative side to this, and that is a general rule. The Greeks could be polemical, individualistic, egotistical, and they always had serious difficulties with any authority figure in their life. Polite consensus was not the norm. Now, at this point, I should confess that when I first heard about this talk, someone gave me the impression I would have 35 or 40 minutes. Not that I needed that. And I came up with this subtitle about Donald Trump. I don't have time to develop this thought, but if I did, I would develop it right now, and I can tell you what direction it would go in. It would go in the direction I've just been describing, which is that in ancient Greece, there are these characters in literature and mythology who are self-absorbed blowhards who desperately need to call attention to themselves. They have no filter. They have no self-control. I have an essay that I've been trying to write for the last year and a half about how Donald Trump is essentially a character out of a comedy by Aristophanes. The parallels are amazing. I started writing this a year and a half ago when it was still funny. It's sort of sitting on the back burner at the moment, and I hope to get back to it. But in Aristophanes' comedies, you will find characters who are these anti-intellectual, crude self-promoters. In one comedy, someone burns down a school, making fun of intellectuals. You hear that phrase, That's your education talking. I know better. Well, this is where it comes from, ancient Greece. Now, I like to think that many of these people were working on a more elevated plane, but I can't blame the Greeks entirely. I have a feeling that the cult of individualism, what we're looking at really is something that comes out of 19th century Romanticism, the cult of the individual. But it was in the early 19th century that Europeans discovered ancient Greece as a model with those heroes, these people of unbridled ambition in tragedy and epic, and also in comedy, and not to mention history. One of my favorite anecdotes about Greek history is the time when the Greeks were trying to decide whom to choose to be their leader before the Battle of Salamis. Themistocles was the obvious leader. All the generals in Greece voted, and it turns out every single general voted for himself. But fortunately, they had another round, and Themistocles was voted to be the commander of this. So there is a positive side to Greek individualism, but also a negative side. Before I finish, though, I need to point out that there is a remarkable exception to this general pattern of Greeks trying to show who's best. And it goes like this. A little Latin here for Emily and me. The translation. For if we must speak of the majesty of things now known to us demands, he was a god, he is Epicurus. Memmius is simply a person who's the addressee of this poem. Epicurus, known as a philosopher, but also a science, important in the history of science, who was the first one to discover this system of life, which is now called wisdom, and who by his scientific method rescued life from such great waves and such great darkness. Epicurus is really important in the history of Western science because he was one of the people who picked up on and promoted Democritus' idea of the atom. And that has had a fruitful afterlife. In fact, it's been essential. He also is important because he and his followers were the people who insisted that there be no supernatural explanations for what happens in the world of science. They were some borderline atheists, essentially. They couldn't quite put it that way, but they had no role for any divine intervention. Scientific things have to be explained as purely naturalistic, materialistic phenomena and nothing else. They were adamant about that. Well, what's curious is that these are the people who were right. They got it right in antiquity. But look at the way Lucretius is praising Epicurus. He was a god known to us, a god, illustrious Memmius, who found all of this. So it turns out that you need a little bit of both. You need to have some people who are willing to look back at traditions and hold on to them, as well as people who are willing to criticize them. By the way, this was all the topic of a book that won the Pulitzer Prize a few years ago, Stephen Greenblatt's book, The Swerve. Fascinating story about the rediscovery of Lucretius in the Renaissance. Turns out that the subtitle of his book, I guess a little bit like my talk today, it doesn't get as much attention as it should in his book, How the World Became Modern. If you really want that, you should read Ada Palmer's book, which came out more recently. She's the one who looks at Lucretius and shows you how scientists and scholars in the 16th and 17th century really read Lucretius, took his materialistic approach to heart, and made advances in science. And I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Our Distinguished Service Awardee at commencement this year was Professor Linda Dumas from the College of Nursing and Health Science. Her career illustrates a long-standing and consistent dedication to social justice and community health that embodies the values and missions of UMass Boston. For more than 30 years, Linda has played an important leadership role on campus and off as a highly regarded nurse practitioner in the area of adult medicine, as an advisor, consultant, trainer, and board member for a wide range of community-based education efforts promoting health and wellness programs in frequently underserved areas, and in originating, managing, and evaluating numerous nursing and public health programs on our campus, creating programs specifically designed to introduce young students of color or from socially disadvantaged backgrounds to the intellectual, professional, and service opportunities available within the field of nursing. In 2011, Linda received funding for the inception of the Boston Free Clinic from the Haymarket Foundation and the Poor People's United Fund. The impact realized through her broad and deep service to our nursing students, health-oriented colleagues, community health organization partners, and the nursing profession is clearly evident and testifies to her commitments to communities both on campus and off. Linda?
Well, thank you. It's very nice to be here. And we're all very different, aren't we? Some very interesting talks, and mine is different also. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the transition between from Columbia Point to Harbor Point. But before I start, when they asked me what I want to talk about here, I thought, well, reflections of the university over a long period of time. I've been here for 34 years. And I thought there were so many things I could have talked about, but the one thing that I've done and stayed with over the years has been my relationship with Columbia Point. And before I start, I wanted to acknowledge a few people here who really have done a great deal of work also. I wanted to share some reflections on the Peninsula from the early 80s to the present. A lot has changed, and I separated the PowerPoint into some sections with brief discussions followed by more PowerPoints, and I have a lot of PowerPoints of people I met at Columbia Point, people who were involved in my work and my study over the years. I also want to acknowledge the Harbor Health Service, Inc., HHSI Board of Directors for giving me the opportunity to be a board member. I've been a board member for over 10 years, and it's going to be time for me to step down. But I've been involved with Columbia Point and Harbor Health since the day I came here. So they gave me an opportunity to really do some ongoing work there and also an opportunity to see how things have changed over time. Columbia Point Health Center was built 50 years ago. It was the very first community health center in the country. And it's iconic because of that. And we just had a 50-year celebration at the Edward Moore Kennedy Institute, I think it was a couple of years ago, and it was wonderful to see all the people who had been involved from the very beginning there, and I'll be citing some of them at the end, my kind of heroes of Columbia Point. So my reflections basically are just going to be over a period of time and remembering the people that I loved very much. And the work that I did, and now doing this makes me want to work more with the archives. There is a Columbia Point archive, and I'd like to work with them. I've given them my dissertation, which was on Columbia Point, and some other things. And I'd really like to see the archives here at UMass evolve into a very special place as time moves on and we occupy this peninsula that's ever changing. And it's not just Columbia Point that's changed. We've changed, the College of Nursing has changed, the university has changed. I can't tell you, how it was 30 years. I can tell you, but you wouldn't know because it was so long ago. So I've listed, I just wanted to acknowledge a few people here who really done some important analyses of Columbia Point. Marie Kennedy, who was a faculty member some time ago, is a wonderful woman, and she wrote some very important pieces of work on public housing and their failure and why they failed and what we what we did by not understanding the situation we were putting them in when we built these huge projects 40 years ago. So Marie, and this will certainly go in the archives, Marie wrote one of the best articles I've read, The Best Laid Plans, she called it, The Early History of Boston's Columbia Point Public Housing. She did that with Trotter Institute, and it's just a wonderful piece of work, and she shows how we really set people up in public housing projects, set them up to fail when they're poor, and they have very few resources. So I want to acknowledge Marie, and her paper, of course, will be in the archives, and always an appreciation, where's Joan? There you are over there. Always an appreciation to the College of Public and Community Service for their support over the years and for the wonderful place it's been for so many years. I wanted to acknowledge Professor Joan Arches sitting over there. Thank you for all the good work that you've done with Dr. Eponte, and your important community studies and your ongoing work with students. You really brought the concept of community a long way, and also an understanding of Columbia Point and the folks there, particularly the kids, and I really appreciate that. Your work contributed to making life better for residents and contributed significantly to the history of Columbia Point. So I hope your work is going to be in the archives. Finally, a heartfelt thanks to Bernie Sneed, who is not here. He was born and brought up in Columbia Point, and he was one of the first people I met when I came to UMass in 1983. Bernie was the liaison between Columbia Point Housing Project and UMass Boston, and UMass Boston was relatively new to the peninsula and been kind of coexisting for a while, and then in the early 80s things began to change. So Bernie left a long time ago. He did so much for me, and he did so much for Columbia Point. You'll see his dad in one of my pictures, but he developed multiple sclerosis, and he's been in long-term care for a long time, and I'm going to go over there to see him with Kareem, who knows him and wants to go over and visit him too, and I want to show him that we're thinking of him. So Bernie, thinking of you and wishing you well at your home. So it's been a fascinating history and the story to be continued. The peninsula is ever changing, and that's good. Change is ongoing, and that's how it should be. And when Joe Corcoran decided to evolve to Harbor Point, many of us who really were very familiar with the way things were in the past had a hard time acknowledging what he was trying to do. And now, years later, I can appreciate what he was trying to do, and I'll kind of tell you a few minutes the outcome of the study I did with the elders, but they didn't fare as badly as I thought they did. They were strong and resilient, and Harbor Place is becoming better every year. So thanks to Joe Corcoran and his hard work. And finally, thank you to the University and the College of Nursing and Health Sciences, my colleagues, for your unwavering support. And now I'm retired, and I really miss the university. I'm a sociologist, and when I came here in 1983, I was studying for my dissertation, and I decided after I came here that I was going to change my topic of dissertation and have my dissertation on Columbia Point. So I got a Jarrow Fellowship. I wanted to work with older people, and I got a Jarrow Fellowship from the Institute on the second or third year that I came, and set up the work that I was going to do at Columbia Point with the elders. And it happened to come at the time when Joe Corcoran was transitioning Columbia Point to Harbor Point. And I wanted to preface with a few remarks, because I have a lot of slides, and it's going to go quickly. I just wanted you to see what it looked like back then, what the university looked like back then, and you know what it looks like now. It's quite beautiful, and some of you may live there, and of course what the university looks like looks like now. It's moving forward. It's very different from when I came, and we're moving to a really good place with our dorms and our parking garages, and we're filling a bigger space in the peninsula. So it's Columbia Point, Harbor Point, it's the university, it's the archives, it's Edward Moore Kennedy, it's JFK's library, and all the other things that are Boston College, High School, all the things that are sharing a home here on the peninsula. So this is an introduction to the community. These slides are small because I had forgotten to scan them, but you can see I don't have my pointer, but you can see the university in the background there, and that's a view from the water, and that's what it looked like a long time ago. It was just a lot of buildings. It looked kind of like a jail. Because of just all the cement and the brick, but you look across the water, and I have a lot of pictures at home, some really good shots of that, and you know, how it changed over time. And I could see that from my office. And the other one that is here is the JFK Institute. So I don't know how well you can see that, but it's there in the background, and you can see the water. It's just a beautiful view. It continues to be a beautiful view. So as a sociologist, I was interested in how people how particularly the elderly would do with dramatic changes, with shifts, and what was going on in their community. So Columbia Point, I started with some pictures of the projects back then. This is what it looked like when I first got here, and this is typical of the projects that they did back in the 50s. High, kind of forbidding buildings, a lot of floors, very dark, small windows, and very crowded together. So these are just the buildings as I saw them then. And there's another one in the 70s. This was all built in the 50s. And they had a very different population living at Columbia Point in the 50s. It was white, older adults, a lot of older adults who started to live there, and then they moved out, and the transition came as more African Americans and Hispanics came, and but everybody shared these views of Columbia Point. And here's just some more buildings, and I told you these will go quickly, but I just think it's important to see what it used to look like. There were a lot of these buildings in Boston, and there still are in some parts of the United States, but these are akin to Cabrini Green in Chicago and some of the other places. Old Colony housing in South Boston, Lenox projects. We had many of these, and since this time, Columbia Point was the beginning, I think, with what Joe did. And I just put a lot of these buildings in so you could see. The next slide here is the church, St. Christopher's, and Father George is still there. He was there 35 years ago, and this was a site of a lot of activities for the people in the community. It's a Catholic church, and there were many weddings and funerals and happy and sad times there. They had a daycare, Montessori daycare there, and they also had a daycare that carried over to UMass for a while. But the daycare was in the church, and a lot of work was done at the daycare and connecting to the community, taking care of the kids. I went over there when I was a new nursing professor with a student and showed the kids how to bandage wounds and you know, what it was like to be a nurse, and it was fun to do that. But that's St. Christopher's, and it's still there. Some of it is a parking lot now, but Father George has been very generous. Louise Day Hicks sign is still over there on Mount Vernon Street. I don't know how many of you remember Louise Day Hicks. She ran for mayor against Kevin White, and she had quite a history, not always a positive one with regard to race. And she was a very controversial figure. She lost, obviously, to Kevin White, but this is still up in the street, on Mount Vernon Street. And I'm trying to see what it says here. I can't see it here. Courage to change. Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't see that. And so that was kind of her motto, but she did not make it. And but I find it interesting that some of the things that were there 35 years ago are still there now, and her sign is still where she posted it on the cement pole. So demolition and loss. And when Corcoran and Company came in and they said we're going to transition this place, we're going to make it beautiful again because it once had trees and flowers in the 50s, and we're going to make it a better place to live. But in the interim, it's going to be some years of demolition and stress. A lot of stress for the people who lived there, and that was one of the major problems. So I call this part demolition and loss. The buildings, you can see the demolition. I put a few slides in here. People elected to stay in the point while their buildings were being demolished. They would be moved across the street or to another street, and the building would be knocked down in front of them. And so it was really very, very stressful. And I think a lot of people, particularly the younger people more than the older people, who I think are pretty resilient, had a lot of post-traumatic stress syndrome after this year and a half of taking down their homes. And they would be living across the street and see buildings, but they elected to stay. Those who wanted to leave could leave. And to get up and look at that in the morning, across the street from your window was very, very stressful. And here's another site. And some of the buildings they tore down totally. Some they just took down the top. So you see some of the buildings that are still there now are from the past, but they've been remodeled. This is the fence. There was a fence that sealed Columbia Point off from the peninsula, and it went all the way around. And this was a fence and this isn't a building. I remember when I did my dissertation, I put one of these photographs in because this is one of the buildings at Columbia Point that was being demolished, or at least in part. And this is Stalingrad, and I thought they looked very much alike, particularly to me at that time when I was living there with the people who lived there. But just the emptiness and the starkness, and the buildings were red brick. And this is really what people had to look at, and that was very hard. This is kind of how Columbia Point looked for a long time. There were no trees, there was no grass, there were no flowers. There was a food truck. There were no eating places. There was a food truck there with an American flag, and there was the health center. So this is what it looked like. These are some of the newer buildings from Harbor Point, and again, they're tall, but they look different. The apartments are very lovely. The people who stayed there, the families who stayed there, had a choice whether they wanted to stay or whether they wanted to go. Many left. Before I move any further with this, I just want to tell you that just the brief demographics. It once housed 6,000 people, and then when I got there, it housed 1,500, almost half of whom were children under the age of 18. There were 350 families left when I got to UMass Boston in 1983. So a lot had happened after 20 years of neglect. 1,000 of the 1,500 apartments were boarded up. So in addition to having some people living there, 300 people living there, there were what Corcoran was faced with boarded up buildings. This is what these people had to look at. So what was being demolished before wasn't too much worse. So this is Harbor Point. This is a street in Harbor Point. They built a lot of houses down by the water and small places for families to live. But what they didn't consider at the time was there was electricity for heat, and the people were still very low income, and they couldn't afford to pay the heat. So that had to be addressed. But the small places are still there. This is the Columbia Point Health Center, the first health center in the country. This is what it looked like. And this is where a lot of people spent their time. There were people who worked there for 35 years. When we had the 50-year anniversary, we had people, receptionist Muriel Rue, who was also kind of a hero of Columbia Point, was there. And people who have been there for many, many years came by to celebrate the holiday, the anniversary. The Senior Center is the next building that I want to show you, and this is where a lot of my work with the elders took place. I teamed up with Sister Joyce McMullen, who had a place called Project Care and Concern when I got there, and did an elder outreach study with my nursing students who were RNs at the time. So the Senior Center was a very important place and still is, but I remember the room like it was yesterday with the piano. We didn't have much music, but we had piano. We had people come in, and that piano is still there. The books, and you can see the picture down there at the bottom. You probably can't see it, but that was the first group of people, the adults who lived in Columbia Point in the 1950s, and that picture is still there in the Senior Center. How's my time? Getting close? Okay, so I'm sorry. So I'm gonna move quickly toward the people at Columbia Point. These are the folks that I knew so well. These were the folks in my elder outreach study, and students would go to visit them and take health histories, and I just began to know them as friends over a period of many, many years. They're gone now. Most of them are gone now, or the few remaining are in their 90s. But this was Ruby May, and she had been there. These were people who lived there for 30, 40 years. Ruby May had been there for 30. This is a couple who had been there for many years, and they all had a very strong community. They were all very connected despite the poverty and despite the disarray over there. Mary Lee was another one, and she was very much a leader, and they had lots of activities, and they all connected together. They weren't best friends, but they were very good neighbors. This is Eddie Lee, and she, I think, is probably one of the only ones who's still here, and I still see her, and she still lives there. She raised an autistic grandchild, as many of the elders did raise grandchildren. Some I think one woman had two Downs grandchildren that she raised, and she was an elder. Eddie Lee raised her grandchild who was autistic for many, many years, and the child is now not a child anymore in group home, but she's a wonderful woman who still goes to visit. She's 92, and she still goes to visit people for Sister Joyce. This was Mother Thomas. They had a wonderful chorus there, and she took part in a lot of our services, and she sang in the church. Her name was Tina Thomas. She had a brother who was ill, and somebody was always taking care of somebody in these families. This is Cozy. Cozy was there for many years, and she moved on to New York when Columbia Point changed to Harbor Point. But Harbor Point, they stayed for a while. They all stayed for a while, and were there for many years after my study. This is Vernell with her cat. One of the things I should point out was when Harbor Point emerged, they didn't want to allow any animals, and that was a big problem because everyone had animals. Many people had animals, cats and dogs there. But as it turned out, we went to court for that, and it ended that the people could keep at least one cat and one dog when they moved. But it was hard for a while just helping people move their animals out. But as it is now, the elderly people can have animals. This is Elizabeth, and this is Bernie's dad, Fred. This is Maddie. I was telling somebody I never saw her without her hat, and I've known her for years. She's since died. But she was quiet, never said much, but she was always there. They were all interconnected, and I think that connectivity was what held them together. Mr. Jones, who used to bring the meals from the Boston Globe to the people of the senior building in a picnic basket every day. Every day he would bring it over there. Glessy, who was an important part of the life there, she was blind, but and this is Leona. And Mr. Young, who was another very important person there. He didn't speak much English, but he certainly was part of the community, a very, very strong part of the community. This is Helena, who came from South Boston from the Old Colony Project, and she loved Columbia Point. Her best friend was there, so she spent a great deal of time with us, and you could see a nice racial mixing with the elders. But she came every day from Southie to do her work and to be part of the community. This is Alice Stacy, who made the papers many, many times, and her friend Lillian. They were very, very good friends, and they were pretty old back then. And Alice had a dog called Good Boy, and the papers were always writing back then. Peter Gelsinis and the Globe and the Herald and the Globe were always writing about Columbia Point and what was happening with the elders, and being very supportive of the changes, the grieving for lost home, that kind of theme. So Alice decided to leave Columbia Point because she couldn't take her dog. And I'll show you the picture and just a little bit of the dog. These are some students that came in with me, with Glessy. This is me with Cozy. And this is Alice again, who was just an incredible lady. And remember, this place was built on a dump, so you could you could see the dump in the back of a lot of these homes. And I can still see Alice when I was a visiting nurse going out there, and she's out there with her many cats and dogs walking amidst all that rubble in the back of the building before they turned over. This is Alice and Good Boy, and she was on TV this day that she moved. They really had a lot of press back in those days, and I have that now put in the archives, but this is Good Boy, the dog she wouldn't part with, who was bigger than she. And so the day they were going to move, she and Good Boy went out. It was on TV. It was on Channel 4 and on the news. Alice was leaving Columbia Point for a new home with her dog, and this is Good Boy. And what happened was the cameras were on everyone, and Good Boy, from all the stress, had congestive heart failure and died on television. So it was really a terrible day, and Joe Corcoran was great. Alice came back, and she could have a cat, and she and I went and picked out an animal, and she lived there for many, many years. But it was stories like this that occupied the folks in the Globe, the writers who really wanted to write about the people. This is a little kid, Say No to Drugs, and this was 30 years ago. Some more little kids with Sister Joyce McMullen. This is Joyce and a child looking at, that was Eddie's granddaughter. That's Joyce and I, and these are the students again from UMass Boston, and these are the Columbia Point heroes in my book, in addition to Joan and Bernie. Dan Driscoll, who was CEO there, president of the health center for almost 40 years. He just retired, did a lot of good work for the people. Jack Geiger, who was from the Delta, who was really the one who started the Columbia Point Health Center with a guy named Count Gibson from down south. He's now in his late 90s. He can't see, but he still came a couple of years ago to speak. He's an eloquent speaker. Paul Gustafson, who was a pediatrician there, 50 years. He just retired. He took care of children, their children, and grandchildren. Ted Kennedy, who was wonderful to us, just wonderful, and his wife continues to be Bernie Sneed, who I mentioned, and Bob Taub, who was when Columbia Point went under receivership in the 80s. Bob Taub was the director he became the executive director of the health center, and he really saved the health center, which emerged as a different place, not necessarily a stronger place when the community changed, but different. Bob went after that to healthcare for the homeless, and then Sister Joyce McMullen, who is still there today doing her work with the people. So did I go over a little bit? I'm sorry. But I just wanted you to see what it was like back then and who the people were. And they're all gone now, but their memories are there. And I think Harbor Point is a continuum of the old Columbia Point. And you can still see vestiges, and we still talk about it. And I hope it'll be a really good archive. Those people were special, and they were resilient and strong. So that was what I remember most about my time at Columbia Point, and I never left. I'm still there.
Thank you all for wonderful presentations. There's now a reception to our left, your right, my left, so I hope you'll all stay and talk to our speakers and others over some refreshments. Thank you.